guys, welcome back to the channel, Just for Beginner Designs, and in this episode it's all about suspension. Now behind me we've got a vehicle that's undergoing a suspension makeover. It's going from the stock suspension over to the Man Emu BP51s. So in this video we're going to have a look at the setup, the performance and price of two different types of setups. So particularly we're going to compare the two between the Pedders Track Rider foam cells and the Man Emu BP51s. So the Pedders Track Rider foam cell shocks that has been built for my particular rig has been built in a way that I have constant load springs, which takes into account the weight that will be applied to the front suspension, such as the front steel bumper. You've got a winch in there that weighs about 30 kilos, and all the various accessories you start bolting onto your winch bumper, such as your spotlights, any antennas. So those are the things that you kind of bear in mind when selecting suspension for your rig. If you have things that are going to be bolted on to your rig at a future date, try and take that into account when you're selecting the suspension for your particular truck. So what you will notice when you buy aftermarket suspensions such as Pedders is that the physical center bore of the shock is a far greater diameter than your stock suspension. So it's got the off-road performance in mind. So with the amount of corrugations that you might be hitting or traveling across over a particular distance and over a set time and speed, that creates a lot of heat in your suspension and does cause suspension components to fail. So with a lot of aftermarket suspension, they have upgraded obviously the size of those shafts, and obviously with the new polyurethane bushes, it makes things a lot smoother and lasts a lot longer than stock suspension. So choosing suspension can be somewhat difficult nowadays. There's so much variety out there, and we're actually spoiled for choice. But the great thing is just that the internet there is a wealth of knowledge, but most of us are dictated by a particular budget, which was my case on my particular vehicle. So I had a very strict budget I had to try and stick to at the time. And I got in contact with Pedders and I said, look guys, I really need your help in terms of setting my truck up. And the customer service was absolutely on point. They asked all the right questions in terms of what weights I was carrying, steel bumpers, winches, any other accessories, and they set the suspension up to exactly what I needed. The suspension has performed superbly well over my stock suspension that I used to have. So I can't fault that in any way. However, there's a few little things that I'd like to point out that are not so great over a period of time with the suspension. We'll highlight that in the pros and cons of both suspensions that we're talking about today. But overall, if you're on a budget, definitely have a look at the Pedders Track Rider foam cells. It's definitely a good option to go for. They are very, very helpful, not only for the front suspension, you've got the rear suspension, you've got leaf packs, and you've got their more elite suspension, which is the Track Rider Extreme, which I haven't had a chance to look at, but I'm sure it's pretty much up there with the BP51s and the Fox shocks out there on the market. So it's definitely worth looking at those particular choices. Now onto the Man Emu BP51s. Now these are the top of their game in terms of suspension components. These things support basically the most advanced suspension technology on the market today. Sporting a nitrogen charged remote reservoir, and the amount of change and adjustability in these shocks is very, very impressive. The components again are very durable, long wearing, and with the off-road tracks in mind, and the amount of adjustability in these shocks again is very, very impressive. These guys at Man Emu, they're really at the top of their game in terms of suspension, and they have things in mind such as if you want to change your bumpers to winch bumpers, add accessories such as winches, roof racks. They have all those things in mind, and it comes with a very, very handy setup guide in terms of setting up your preload and basically your compression, your rebound, and along with your preload of your springs as well. There's very, very good clear guides on your instructions, especially on the payload of the rear of your vehicle, so a lot of our weight is on the rear, but they have an overall setup guide on how to set this up correctly, which is very, very handy. What you'll notice with the BP51s and most aftermarket suspension is, compared to stock, the overall shaft has been increased in size on the aftermarket components. As you can see on the BP51s, it's pretty hefty. They've got a lot of oil going in there to keep things nice and cool, especially if you're traveling on very corrugated roads. Just keep that suspension nice and cool and stops the suspension from overheating and stops everything basically from premature failure. And these suspension components from factory are not too bad for what they are, but if we subject them to obviously more extreme off-road conditions, they do tend to fail prematurely, hence why we have these options such as the BP51s and the Pedders track riders out there. As you can see from the components on the BP51, everything in mind here is basically from a metal construction. From the top of the tower, that's all metal construction, all the way down into the lower pin, and which sports some of the most advanced sort of polyurethane bushes for longevity and keep those components performing at their best. So what you'll notice with the stock suspension, I mean, this has been in the truck for a few years, probably about 3 or 4 years, and what you do have on more cheaper shocks is these bushes tend to fail and creating a lot of play in the bush in your suspension components. When you're going over corrugations, you do tend to obviously feel those movements and those knocks. What you'll also notice in the stock suspension is the actual rubber on the top here. That tends to sort of crack and fail. That's one thing that I've noticed on my Pedders. That has started cracking and started failing after a period of time. But with these BP51s, obviously with the price you pay for them, everything is aftermarket machined with braided hoses, so you will know and you have confidence in your suspension that these components are not going to fail. So now to the pros and cons of the suspension components behind me. So we've got the Pedders track rider in my vehicle, and we've got the BP51 suspension from Old Man Emu in Will's truck on my left, your right. So the track riders or the Pedders suspension is pretty good budget suspension to go for. It's basically not upgradable, but basically custom buildable to a particular setup that you may have for your in mind for your truck, such as a winch bumper or a winch. So you can contact the guys from Pedders and they can set the suspension up for you if that's the particular build you're going for. In terms of the actual suspension themselves, it has performed very, very well, like I touched on before, compared to stock suspension. Now the BP51, as you can imagine, they're top of their game. They have world-class technology all crammed into those suspension components. So you can imagine the performance that will come from these suspension components will be next level. So the overall quality of the BP51s, again, is something that it's almost, you can't really compare the two. It's full aluminium construction. The quality throughout is unbelievable. When you get your hands on these, you can really see the attention to detail and the technology that's been crammed into these suspension components. In terms of the cons for both suspension components, in terms of the Pedders side of things, you've got Pedders are not really rebuildable in that way, so they're not really serviceable. However, the BP51s are serviceable and can be serviced and repaired over a long period of time. So it's worth kind of weighing up those two options. So if you're in the market for some suspension that will stand the test of time and last, obviously, the life of your truck, then the BP51s is probably worth the investment. Now, what I found the cons-wise with the Pedders as well is that some of the rubber components are not really up to scratch for longevity, such as the rubber top hat that is started cracking and failing in certain areas. And I have noticed the bushings are not as performance related compared to the other components on the market. So you might want to have a look at looking for Super Pro bushes before you chuck them in there. That will probably stand the test of time currently than the ones I have in there at the moment, and they are failing slightly cosmetically. That's mainly due to the amount of salt we have on our roads here. It's just ridiculous. The only cons that I can find with the BP51s is obviously price. They are quite pricey for what they are, but again, I just want to reiterate, you are getting what you pay for. Ultimate suspension that will probably stand the test of time and is serviceable. So they will probably outlast our trucks. Hopefully that'll be a great investment. So, I mean, there's loads of information there that we've tried to cram into this little video. Look forward to a future video where we're going to get Will and my truck basically toe to toe. We'll go out off-road and we'll actually compare the differences, the performance of both suspension, and trying to get a real life feedback from Will and see how he's basically getting the feedback set up for and the setup for his truck. So if you guys have any questions or comments, please let me down below. Without further ado, we will definitely see you in the next one.